Welcome to the SDSU Studio Series. In the midst of what is happening in the world today, we have created a series of digital conversations with Broadway professionals where we talk about the craft and the business of Broadway and how we can pass along this legacy to the next generation of musical theater artists. The SDSU Studio Series is organized by the SDSU MFA Musical Theatre Program. This program is one of only a handful of graduate degrees offered in the United States that offer the terminal degree in musical theater, and our graduates are acting, directing, choreographing, music directing, writing, and teaching in university positions worldwide. Our goal is to bring the professional world and the academic world together so that students of musical theater are prepared for today's job market. My name is Robert Meff. I worked as a professional conductor, music director, and orchestrator on Broadway for 22 years before moving to San Diego to become head of the MFA Musical Theatre Program. My goal is that every person who wants to be a musical theater artist is able to access what is going on in the professional world, which led me to creating this series and leads me to my next guest, Stephen Schwartz. Thank you, Stephen.
Hi, happy to be here, Rob.
Thank you. Before we begin, I want to give some expectations of today's discussion. If you have questions, feel free to use the question and answer function built into Zoom. After my questions are completed, I will ask questions from your submissions. And hey, if you're out there from a university musical theater program, type the name of your school in the chat function. I would love to see who's represented from all over the country. So let's begin. Stephen Schwartz has written the hit musicals Godspell, Pippin, and Wicked. He has contributed lyrics for a number of successful films, including Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Prince of Egypt, and Enchanted. Schwartz won the Drama Desk Award for Outstanding Lyrics, 4 Grammy Awards, 3 Academy Awards, and has been nominated for 6 Tony Awards. He received the 2015 Isabel Stevenson Award, a special Tony Award for his commitment to serving artists and fostering new talent. I'm so thrilled to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming, Stephen.
Thanks, happy to be here, and hi to all the students out at SDSU.
That's great. So my first question is, the university musical theater community is adapting to the coronavirus outbreak by migrating classes online and providing content like this interview to students and educators nationwide. How is Broadway coping, and how are you coping?
Well, Broadway is coping by not being there, basically. You know, as everybody probably knows well, right now, all live theater is shut down. You know, we have hopes that Broadway will be able to reopen in September, and that, you know, it's possible that some of the touring shows may even be able to open sooner than that. On the other hand, you know, we don't know. It's all going to depend on how the flattening of the curve of the virus and handling that goes. In the meantime, I and most people I know are staying kind of surprisingly busy, doing a bunch of things like this, doing sort of online classes. I know there have been online readings of new plays. We've been doing various fundraisers, you know, I spent my entire day up until seeing you, basically doing some recording of a couple of tracks that are going to be used for various fundraisers, including a 90th birthday thing for Steve Sondheim that's coming up this weekend. And you may know that I did something. I played When You Believe for this thing called the Saturday Night Seder, and then that became very popular. So now I had to pre-record an audio track for that so that Cynthia and Shoshana could re-sing it in better quality, so that could be released. The point being, like, we're just all, each day goes by and we think this was supposed to be boring, where we were just all stuck inside, and instead everybody seems busier than ever.
Well, it's great to see that there's an increase of creativity and productivity. I'll have to say that Mary Mitchell Campbell was a guest here last week, and she's
she's, as you know, she's musical directing the Sondheim thing on Saturday. And yeah, a friend of mine is calling this the Corona Songs. because everybody is just because we're all here, we're all like, and maybe one feels the urge to be as creative and productive as possible in a kind of defiance. Maybe that's part of what's going on.
It is very true. We had Andrew Lippa here on Monday, and of course he puts his creativity in a different way. Of course, he's writing, the Tiger King, the musical. So
right, songs about Tiger King.
Also very funny and also very needed. So
right.
This really has been a very busy year for you. So where are you in your current projects during this, like Prince of Egypt or Children of Eden? Where are those?
Yeah, well, of course, again, Prince of Egypt, which had just opened in the West End in London, and things were going well, but now the West End is shut down. So again, we're hoping for around about September to be able to return. But what I was fortunately able to do through sort of fortuitous timing was do the cast album for Prince of Egypt, which I think came out about a week ago on Ghostlight Records. And so we were very happy to have that out there. And also there was a production of the very highly revised new version of Rags, which had happened in London, and that got recorded. So this past week I've been working again, via Zoom and other digital platforms on completing that cast album. So that's now done, and there's a possible movie project I may be doing with my frequent collaborator Alan Menken, and we were commissioned, I suppose is the word, to write 3 songs for it. We don't know if the project's going to happen, but we, over the past couple of weeks, again via FaceTime and Dropbox, have been working on those. So yeah, projects keep going on, and hopefully at some point there'll be outlets for them again.
Right. I'm so curious about Rags. It is an extraordinary score and a wonderful story. So this time through, were you working with a director as dramaturgically, or how did these revisions come about?
Maybe a year, or maybe it's now 2 years ago, the authors were approached by Goodspeed, the theater in Connecticut that frequently does new musicals and obviously productions of existing musicals, about doing Rags. And the authors were resistant, to be honest, because we felt that we had never really solved the show, and Goodspeed is kind of highly visible. But then they came back to us and said, look, we feel because of the current situation with immigration and sort of the renewed controversy about immigrants, the show has become extremely timely again. What if we had a book writer come in, since Joe Stein, our original book writer, had passed away, and the show was revised to see if we could make it work. And so with the very gracious consent of Elisa Stein, Joe's widow, and the executive of his estate, we brought in David Thompson, who is among other things, the book writer for the Scottsboro Boys, which is a musical I admire very much. And working with David, Charles Strauss and I, basically very, very much revised the show. So there are new songs and many, many repurposed songs with the music that was written for maybe another point in the show that's been repurposed to suit the new script. And I think maybe about 75% of the lyrics are new. So it's really significantly reimagined. And in the few productions we've had so far, it's been very well received. So now, as I say, there'll be an album, and MTI will be licensing it. So we'll be happy to have a version of the show that we feel is more successful and more viable out there in the world.
It's so fascinating, and it really couldn't be more current. When approached with a project like this is a show that's been a previously written show, and you're coming back to it not only years later in your own life, but also years later in like the life of the history of the United States. So where did you start? Like, how did you know what you needed fixing? Do you know what I mean?
I do. Sure, of course. Well, I think, and I think you framed the question very accurately. We looked at the show itself as if it didn't exist in time, as if we were just looking at the structure and what we felt didn't work about the original way that the story was told, and made huge adjustments. Characters were dropped, new characters were added, incidents were let go of, and others brought into their place, etc. But then, as you say, we were also aware of the times that we live in, and our research showed us that, you know, at that time, there was huge resistance against these immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. And in fact, there was one congressman who proposed building a wall to keep them out. And there were all these demonstrations against them and violence against them. And we found many political cartoons about how, you know, they were taking away American jobs and changing our culture, and all the arguments one hears today, but, you know, leveled at, in this case, the Jews from Eastern Europe, but also, you know, Italians and other immigrant groups who were coming over then. And now, you know, of course, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren forget about this. And, you know, people have very short memories, it seems, but exactly what's being said now about immigrants from other parts of the world were what was being said then, and making assimilation quite difficult for those groups when they came in.
But it's incredibly admirable, because one of the functions of art, one of the many functions of art, is to remind us, right? In case we forget.
I think the major thing that maybe all art does, but in particular theater does, and it's why I fell in love with theater, you know, when I first saw it as a kid, and why I've been happy to be in it my whole life, is I think it's about empathy. It makes us, good theater makes us see things from other people's points of view, and see the way that we resonate with them. And that's, I think empathy is maybe the thing most lacking in contemporary society and in contemporary America. And that's why I think theater and the arts in general are very important.
I agree. I agree. So let's go back, way back when. So many of our students tuning in today are currently studying musical theater.
Great.
How did studying at Juilliard in high school, and then your undergraduate degree from Carnegie Mellon for college, help you to develop as an artist?
Enormously. I'm a huge, I was going to say a huge believer in, you know, the education, but that sounds, you know, that's such a sort of fatuous thing to say. So I'll just speak from my point of view. You know, in a university setting, you can do a lot of things that you won't have the opportunity to do when you get out into the real world. You can learn craft that then you're not going to have time to be learning about. You can, you know, deal with roles and ideas and different things that maybe you're not perfectly typecast for, but they broaden you. You know, at Juilliard, I got a very solid foundation in music theory and composition and sight reading, which helped me a lot when I first started out and was being an accompanist and playing for auditions, etc. And then, of course, at Carnegie Mellon, I had a very broad education in, you know, I was never going to be an actor, but I took 4 years of acting, and that really helped me learn how to write for actors and what they need in order to perform something dramatically. And I learned about the history of theater and, you know, design. Again, I was never going to be a set designer or a lighting designer, but all of this is very, very helpful. And I feel that between Juilliard and Carnegie Mellon, when I actually entered the professional world, I had a lot of tools at my disposal. So I found those, both those experiences extremely valuable, and I don't know that I would have been able to achieve as much as I was able to, particularly early on, if I hadn't had that kind of solid background.
Yeah, I of course have worked with your material for years in my own career, and have watched other people sing and interpret your music. And what I remind people every time I work with them was, I say, Stephen Schwartz had 4 years of acting when he was in college, and let's start there.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
so much,
you know, I myself am a really bad actor. You know, it didn't teach me to be a good actor, because I don't have the talent for that. But what it taught me was what good actors are doing, and how to try to write things that are actable.
Absolutely. Well, it certainly shows in your work. It's quite
Thank you.
extraordinary. I want to talk a little bit about the music end of it for just a moment. So two of your earlier works, both Godspell and Pippin, both really brought a new sound to Broadway in the early 1970s. And it really ushered in an entire new era of musical theater history. So how did your early show, this is a two-part question, how did your early shows honor the legacy of the Golden Age? And then how did they rebel against it?
I think, first of all, I grew up on Long Island, close to New York City. My parents, neither of whom are in the arts, were avid theater goers, as well as concert goers, et cetera. And so from a very early age, they took me to see shows, musicals, and then subsequently plays. And I fell in love with musical theater from the first time I saw it. And so I saw a lot of classic shows, either in their actually original productions, such as Gypsy. I saw in its original production with Ethel Merman, that's how old I am, and Funny Girl, and Fiddler on the Roof, and I even saw late in their runs My Fair Lady and West Side Story. So I saw a lot of, and then there were revivals, you know, Brigadoon and Finian's Rainbow, et cetera. I saw a lot of classic musicals. I used to go to the library and, because that's what we had in those days, and take out the libretti for musicals and read them and sort of see how they were structured. And I listened to a lot of cast albums. So I think I really had a very solid foundation of musical theater structure. And I used to ask myself, you know, why does this song work? Why do I really like it? What is the composer or the songwriters doing to make it so effective? And, you know, how is Oscar Hammerstein structuring his shows? And, you know, what is a Jerome Robbins show in terms of how the opening number works and what the first song for the leading character is, and all these sort of crafty questions. On the other hand, when, you know, sort of when I was in college, particularly, I started getting much more interested in terms of what I was listening to pop music and to sort of the singer-songwriters of that era, which were, I don't know, you know, how many of the kids who are watching now, you know, how many, but I think these names, you know, remain classic. It was the Motown sound, first of all. You know, there was Joni Mitchell and Paul Simon and James Taylor and Laura Nyro. And, you know, these songwriters were very, very influential on me, and that's what I was listening to. So I think when I started writing for theater, I used sort of the structure, the classic musical theater structure of theater songs, but the music was more like the pop music I was listening to. And that combination at that time was unusual in Broadway theater.
It really did change everything. There's a reason why we have auditions say there's a golden age of musical theater, and then there's what they loosely call contemporary musical theater, and it just happened, right? And you were part of the birth of that. It's
that was it. It really, in a way, started with Hair, which was before me, but then myself, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's a contemporary of mine, Alan Menken, of course, we were sort of writing the music that we heard and were singing in our cars, but bringing a dramaturgical sensibility to it, and it did basically change it. So I remember when I was first starting out, there was quite a lot of criticism saying like, well, you can't use this kind of music to tell theater stories, but now all musical theater is basically pop music. So it did change.
Well, I was heavily influenced by the Godspell score. My older sister was in a Godspell, was in a production of Godspell in high school, and I remember running out to buy the score. And I should personally thank you for introducing me to Laura Nero because of your very clever tempo description for "Bless the Lord," which is a la Laura Nero, and I'd never heard of her before, so I went and got an album.
There's no other way to explain it, so yeah.
Exactly. I thought that was very clever. I want to go a little further with your music. You're saying that a lot of your music has this owes a debt to Joni Mitchell and James Taylor, and many of your songs, like "All Good Gifts" from Godspell, are a straight-ahead pop song with a standard verse-chorus form. Yet you have some of your work, like West End Avenue in Magic Show, is full of mixed meters and very complex harmonic progressions. Where did this breadth come from, and does it relate to character and situation?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, I'm again, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, that when I was at Carnegie Mellon and doing all these acting classes, etc. I try to write from the inside out. I try to write internally, like what's the voice of this character, and how would he or she express him or herself, and then the music sort of comes from there. So yeah, I mean, I'm not consciously saying, well, also I will say, like, each score has what Alan Menken says is, like, he tries to find for each project he's doing, what is the palette, the musical palette for that project. And, for Alan, obviously, the kind of music he's writing for Aladdin is going to be different from the kind of music that he's writing for Newsies or, Little Mermaid. And, Prince of Egypt is going to have a whole different harmonic world than Wicked is, or than Pippin is. But then within that, I'm always trying to come from character.
So I mean, a lot of these listeners here are actors, and wanted to just expand on that a little bit. Like, how should an actor approach your work? Like, when we coach your songs, all we have is, your sheet music. You're not, of course, in the room with us. So what could you tell us about how we start? Like, how do you give people the clues? And one more thing, just like, how limited are you by notation? Like, do you ever get frustrated that you can't?
That's such a great question. I think, because your question is part of what I was going to answer. Notation is not really accurate, at least for me. I do know other composers who feel differently, and they will write exactly the rhythm that they hear. They'll write a 30-second note, and tied to a 16th, and, really try to nail the rhythm, and every rest that's put in there is like, there's a rest there, so you need to breathe right there, etc. I don't do that. I give performers more leeway, and what I'm writing is basically the song, but I'm expecting at least the vocal part, I'm expecting it to be interpreted rhythmically and through the acting experience, and really for it to be about the story and the words, so that it feels almost improvised. It feels like it's happening right at that moment in the best performance. And indeed, every performance should be slightly different. Even if it's the same performer, every time you sing the song, it will be a little bit different. And indeed, whenever I sing my own songs, I never sing them exactly the same way twice, because what's going on at that particular point in the who I'm singing to, how I'm feeling that day. Just like if you were in a play, you would never give an identical performance every single night. It would be within a parameter, but if it's going to have life, it's going to be changed depending upon what your other actors are doing and what you're bringing and the temperature, if you will, in the room. And so that's really what I'm assuming is going to happen. And I'm very, because I am a lyricist, I'm very lyric driven. Even though a lot of my songs may have had music first, really the lyrics are important to me, and them making sense in terms of how they're acted. And I've heard performances of songs of mine by very good singers, but I will sort of feel like, well, it's as if English is their second language. They sang all the notes and all the words, but it didn't actually make sense. I didn't really get that it was coming from inside them and they really knew what they were singing about. So to me, that is paramount. And I'm very forgiving, if you will, or flexible about people who change things a little bit. I will say again, I know very specifically of other composers who do not feel that way at all. And they want their song to sound exactly the same every time, no matter who sings it. But maybe because I'm a little bit more pop oriented, I don't feel that way.
Yes, well, I've worked with Adam Gettle, so I know what you're talking about.
I'm not naming any names.
Sorry, maybe I shouldn't have. I wanted to ask, when you write, are you writing autobiographically? Are there specific characters in your musicals that at the core are you?
I think all writers, well, again, I shouldn't generalize it. I will answer your question as you asked it, which was specific to me. Yes, I'm always writing autobiographically, in that I try to find myself in every character, and what part of me is that character, and how does that part of me respond to this situation? Yeah, I feel like that's the only way I know how to write, is to write from the inside out. I mean, I am much more Elphaba than I am Glinda, but in order to find Glinda, I had to be Glinda and find that part of me. I couldn't sort of hold her at a distance and write, if you will, in the third person. It always has to be written in the first person.
I want to unpack a little bit about Wicked for a moment. And Glinda, I've noticed that, I mean, you were working with a terrific performer in Kristen Chenoweth, of course, who was involved with the project for a long time, who has a tremendous head voice and also a tremendous chest voice. Was it deliberate, your usage, your register, where you put your voice in, did that relate to her character?
Completely. First of all, when I first envisioned the character, the music for the character of Glinda, there was no soprano in the very, very early going of it. But as you say, Kristen was involved with us for, I think, about 3.5 years of the development process. And she, said early on, look, I have the soprano. I never get to use it. I'd love to have an opportunity to use it in the show. And at first I couldn't envision how to do it, If you think about a song like Popular, that's all chest. There's no soprano in it at all. And a lot of the other stuff I had written for Glinda at that point did not use the soprano register. But then I thought about, because of Kristen's request, I thought about Glinda in the movie of The Wizard of Oz and the Billy Burke, and it's all this sort of high warbly soprano. But in the movie of The Wizard of Oz, she's very public. You only see her as a public figure, sort of singing to the Munchkins or singing to Dorothy, but she never expresses her own inner feelings. So I thought, well, what if that's the voice that Glinda uses in public? And so that's why when she first appears in the bubble at the in the opening, she's singing in a soprano, and there are other places where her soprano has to do with the public face of Glinda. Yeah, so it became a character choice, but it was a choice made entirely because of the actress, you know, originally playing Glinda, and my enormous admiration and affection for her.
Of course, she's really wonderful. There were many versions of Wicked before you settled on the current version that's now running on Broadway. What is the biggest change that you can remember, or any fun stories about the older version of the show? And I also want to unpack a little bit about what's it like to work with a librettist like Winnie Holtzman in the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't exactly call them versions. It's just part of the development process of a musical, that to get from the initial idea to the finished show, and by finished, I mean the point at which you were forced to abandon working on the show because it finally opened. But even after that, you can usually fix it a little bit. You usually have opportunities. Sure, lots and lots happened. Early on in the process, we learned a few things, and this was, you know, working with Winnie Holtzman. She and I, first of all, we began, as I always begin, by trying to work out the structure of the show, the outline, if you will, the storyboard of it, before we wrote anything, before Winnie wrote any dialogue, before I wrote any songs. Of course, I would write little notions for music and possible ideas, and she would play around with how the characters spoke, and but basically we spent a year getting the structure of it, and then she started to write, and you know, I could kind of get the how they talked, you know, what's the tone, what's the style of this. She invented the idea that there would be what we came to call Ozisms, that there would be words that were slightly different than English words, you know. People would say horrendable instead of horrendous or horrible, that kind of thing, so that the audience would understand what was being said, but there was this sense of being in another place, in another world. But what we discovered as we went along, and the early iterations of the show were not focused as much on the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda. In a way, it was more like Gregory Maguire's book. When I first started working on the show, I was thinking of it as a sort of single person's journey, like, you know, Funny Girl, that it was going to be Elphaba's journey. And then gradually we came to realize that it was really about this relationship. And that, in fact, somebody who came to an early reading, it was actually Jeffrey Seller, who had nothing to do with the show, the producer of Hamilton, among other things, but happened to, as a favor to me, come to an early reading. And he came up and said, listen, whenever you've got those two girls together on stage, and whenever it's about them, you are in gold. And whenever it's not, you're in trouble. So focus on that. And that was extremely good advice. And the show did change because of that. The other thing we came to realize is that audiences were bringing into the experience of seeing the show, whether it was a reading or ultimately the show, the movie, The Wizard of Oz. Right. They were not bringing Gregory Maguire's book, even if they'd read it. They were not bringing the L. Frank Baum stories, even if they'd read them. They didn't care how much we departed from them, but the movie was like a documentary. And so we came to realize that we couldn't do anything that contradicted the movie. And so that changed the writing of the show. And of course, there were many other things as we went along. You know, places we realized songs weren't working, or characters were unclear, or it was taking 20 minutes to tell part of the story that should be taking 5 minutes. You know, all those sort of things that change as you develop a show.
I'm so curious about that, and I'm kind of fascinated by the subject of feedback. And so musical theater, of course, is a hugely collaborative art form. I mean, you're not writing a novel. So you have lots of people that give feedback. And I guess I have two questions, which is, one, how do you distinguish good feedback? And then how do you give good feedback when you're asked to give it?
That's a great question. Musicals are maybe the most collaborative art form that I can think of. If you don't like collaboration, and if you don't like to revise work and constantly, you know, try to fine tune it and make it better, and if you're not open to hearing ideas from outside and sort of sorting through them, you shouldn't be writing musical theater. It's not the it's not the medium for you. What I've learned about feedback from individuals is that it needs to resonate for you. If somebody says something to you and it's right for the show, you'll tend to think either, oh, of course, I knew that already. I just was too lazy to do it. Or, oh my God, yes, of course. Why didn't I think of that? You'll immediately, but if you hear something, no matter how smart it is, that just is like, sounds right, but I don't know, just feeling uncomfortable with it, it's probably wrong. Richard Maltby, and you'll excuse my language a little bit here, but it's a direct quote. He said to me, Richard Maltby, the wonderful book writer, creator of Ain't Misbehavin' and other things, once said to me, you know, it's not stupid people with stupid ideas who fuck up your musical. It's smart people with really smart ideas who fuck up your musical. So you have to be careful about making sure that the advice, because you'll be listening to everybody. You'll want to listen to everybody. So sort of, that's one of the things you learn with experience, what to listen to and what not to. The other thing is that once you start getting performances, again, I think maybe it was Richard who said this, somebody said, like, individual audience members, if you talk to them, they're almost always wrong, but as a whole, the audience is always right. And you can just sit in an audience, even in a reading, and you just feel the temperature around you. You can feel where you're losing them, or where they're really engaged, where there's not a sound, where there's not a cough. You can just feel it. And I've learned, you ask about giving useful feedback in return. And what I've learned to do, because it's what works for me, see, people, when they give criticism, they feel like they need to be constructive. So they'll say something like, in that scene in the second act, she should throw the chair, and you hear it and you're like, well, that's a terrible idea. Of course that shouldn't happen. But so what you have to do is think like, okay, that's a bad idea, but there's something making them suggest it. What is that? You kind of have to try and figure out their train of thought. So what I try to do for people, if they ask me to come see something in process, is cut out the suggestion and just say things like, I was bored from here to here. I didn't care about so-and-so. I didn't understand why she did thus and so. Just give them, not try to solve their problem for them. Just tell them where I had problems, and where I didn't. And I know for me as a writer, that's the most useful kind of feedback to get.
That's so fascinating. I will say Richard Maltby was a guest here, the Studio Series, last Monday, and
He's great.
he is great. He didn't use the same language, though. I don't know why.
Oh, well, that's what he said to me.
I'm sure he did. So I want to, my next question, how do you think your process has changed from the beginning of your career to now? Like in terms of your writing process, or even like the ability to accept feedback, like sort of a continuation of what we were just talking about. Has that changed?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I started out, first of all, I was very young. I was pretty inexperienced. I was going so much on instinct, and I think I was aware of that, and because of that, there was a kind of inner defensive-ness. You know, I thought like I could lose the show if I listened too much to other people. It was harder for me to hear feedback, and I was much less sort of conscious of what my process is, and I was frankly less trusting of the process. And over time, even though God knows I've had things that didn't succeed, you know, but I've become much more trusting of the whole process and not feeling threatened by it. You know, that eventually with your collaborators, you will get to a show that it represents what you all want to do.
I want to go back and talk about collaboration in a very specific sense, and talk about your collaboration with an orchestrator. For instance, Bill Brown for Wicked. What is that relationship like? What do you give him? Or any of your orchestrators? What is that like?
Yeah, that's one of the most important collaborations, obviously, for a composer. And what I do, because I'm a keyboard player and because I write at the keyboard, basically, is I give the orchestrator a complete piano vocal. I mean, every now and then there'll be something where it's like, look, this is really a guitar song, or this is a field song, and so I'm going to give you, you know, a lead sheet, or, you know, or here's a drum loop. But almost always it's keyboard based, and so I give them the complete piano part, and then, you know, we sort of again, you don't want to shortcut the ability of the orchestrator whom you've presumably chosen because they're very talented and can do things that you can't do and are bringing another sensibility to it. You don't want to, you want to give them the chance to use that. So I will say things like, you know, I'm hearing a French horn line here, but very, very rarely. Mostly it will be like, this should feel very cold here, and then this needs to get like spiky, but here it needs to kind of warm up. And I try to give feeling things, and then have the orchestrator interpret that in terms of how he or she does the instrumentation to deliver those feelings. You know, you mentioned Laura Nero before, and there was a famous story about her where she came into a session and heard the strings part that had been written for one of her songs, and she was like, the violins just need to be more purple. And somehow her arranger understood what that meant. And yeah, so that's what I try to do. But we will have, like with Prince of Egypt, you know, I work with a great orchestrator named August Eriksson, who also did Come From Away and a couple of other shows. And he's very, very good at sort of culture, at like, this is the culture of this place, and therefore the instrumentation, here are some instruments that they use in that kind of music. And so with Prince of Egypt, I really encouraged August to use authentic instruments of the Middle East. And, you know, sometimes when we, in fact, in the writing process, as we got late into the show, and like I was replacing an intro for one of the songs, and we decided, since we had this wonderful kind of Egyptian guitar called an oud in the orchestra, I was like, I think this should be oud based. So how do I do that? And he was like, well, here are the keys that you can write in for the oud that it's good in. You know, you can do a D chord and a G chord and an A chord, but don't do a B flat, you know, like that. And then I built it around that. So there is a lot of back and forth with the orchestrator that makes the composition process fun.
And no one listening should be surprised that August knew that off the top of his head.
Oh, I mean, he's amazing. And then he learns how to play them all.
Yes, he does. Yes, I've worked with him a couple of times. He's pretty amazing.
Extraordinary.
Your comment about writing at the keyboard reminds me of something Stravinsky said. I don't know if you've ever heard this. He said, there are two types of composers in the world: those who write at the keyboard and those that say they don't.
Oh, well, that's very interesting, but it's not entirely true. I do know composers, you know, and they say the opposite. You know, Leonard Bernstein used to say that he tried to get himself not to write at the keyboard because he felt he then wasn't limited by his own technique, though he had fabulous piano technique. But for me, as I said, because I'm writing internally and trying to express an emotion, it's not really intellectual. I sort of, things come out of my fingers without my really being in control of them. And then I kind of hear them and I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds right. And sometimes I hit wrong notes that then I like better than the right notes, that kind of thing. So then I'll make adjustments when I actually prepare the music. But for me, the sort of emotional experience of putting hands on the piano is part of the writing process.
I'm so glad you brought up Leonard Bernstein. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with him? Not personal relationship, but just a collaborative relationship. What did you gain from working with him?
Lenny was the closest thing to a mentor that I ever had. And I think I gained so much just by watching him, his process, and how he moved through the world, how he behaved towards other people. In some cases, how he let things, criticism and other things bother him and hamper his process. You know, there were both very positive ways of dealing with composition and ways I felt he let things inhibit that. And then I felt like, gee, I have to avoid that, but I should emulate this. That was very, very helpful. I mean, there are things about my compositional style that you can clearly see were influenced by Bernstein. You can hear it in at the very end of No One Mourns the Wicked. You can hear it in the bass note of the chord. It's so Bernstein. But I think that influence was in me, you know, because I listened to so much of his music. It would have been there whether I'd worked with him or not. But it was more how to be that I learned from him, and also in some ways how not to be.
Interesting. So get back to our audience here for a second. There's a lot of course, there are many students in BFA programs worldwide. And what do you see as the big benefit of having so much musical theater training? And a corollary to that question is what do you find that's still missing?
Again, it's what I said about my own school experience. I feel that the kids who come out of a really good BFA program, they just have a leg up. I see it over and over again at auditions, and you know, particularly when they're getting started. Otherwise, you know, people spend their 20s sort of catching up, to be honest. Listen, you can't teach people to be talented. Talent is what it is. But you can, one can learn how to make the most of your talent and get to understand what your strengths are, and also who you are as an artist, if you will. And I think, you know, those training programs can be very helpful for that. And just the knowledge and the craft, and as I say, playing roles that you're not going to play. You know, you're gonna play Mrs. Lovett, you know, in your college, and then when you're 19 years old, and then you're going to get out, and it's going to be 40 years before you have an opportunity, if ever, to play that role again. But how much you'll learn from playing it, you know. So things like that, I think they're really valuable. In terms of what's missing, I don't know. I mean, I could be critical of any individual program and say, like, gee, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. But overall, I'm seeing people, particularly in the last 10 years, come from several of the better musical theater training programs, and they are really well trained. You know, they're really solid.
Well, the educators who are listening will be very happy to hear that. Do you have any final thoughts about advice to young artists, whether they're music directors or orchestrators or actors pursuing, before we move on to the Pivot questionnaire?
Yeah, I think to make you, and I would say this to first of all, when I have two pieces of advice, one while you're still in school and one right after you get out of school. While you're still in school, try to recognize how much of an opportunity this is. I know that I look back on so many wasted opportunities when I was at Juilliard, and somewhat less so when I was at Carnegie Mellon. And I'm like, why the hell didn't I write? I had a string quartet that was just waiting to play anything that people wrote. Why the hell didn't I write some string quartets and learn more? You know, that kind of thing. You've got around you in the student body others who want to do things and try things and just make use of that. And you've got all these opportunities that it's easy to take for granted, because when you're young, you don't have the experience to realize how rare this opportunity is. So I just think all people like me, who, you know, who are on the other side of it, can do is just tell them that. And then when I think when you get out, I think you just have to put yourself out there and seize any opportunity you can get. If you're a musical director, you know, intern for people and be a copyist and see if you can, you know, play for auditions. And you know, if you're a performer, do readings and put together a cabaret show, and just like you can't wait for things to come to you. Everybody is out there trying to get noticed, and the sort of curious paradox about people, you know, who are the job givers, if you will, is that everybody is looking for the next new talented person, but nobody wants to know about anybody new. And so you need to get from the first, the nobody wants to know about anybody new, to wait a minute, that's somebody I should know about. And the only way you can do is put yourself out there. If you're a writer, have written something and have an example readily available of what you've written. You know, I think it's well known that I'm quite friendly with Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, and I, you know, knew them from when they were at University of Michigan. And one of the things that always impressed me about what they did and why they got off to such a fast start, I mean, of course, they're extraordinarily talented, but the other thing that they did was, while they were still at the University of Michigan, they wrote a whole bunch of songs, and they got all these talented kids who were there to record them. And then they had this recording of their songs that they could just whip out and hand to anybody who was interested in them. And it really helped them to get work early on. Of course, the work was good, you know, if it's no good, it's not going to help. But the fact was, they didn't just say like, oh, well, we're writers. You know, they were like, we're writers and here's some stuff we've written. And so, yeah, that's the advice I would give.
That's amazing. I'm so grateful for these great answers to these questions. I'm going to move on to what's called the pivot questionnaire. And
I thought there were pivot questions.
well, they could be that.
What I
Well,
know. I like pronouncing them pivot, though I
I
don't know
know.
exactly what that means. But
Well, they come from a French series that was called Bouillon de Culture, and it was hosted by a man named Bernard Pivot. So that he wrote these questions.
I thought it was a word.
Yeah, but most of us know them as the questions that Jim Lipton used to ask every guest at the end of Inside the Actor Studio. So he was a colleague of mine at Pace University, and he passed away this past year. And this little section is an homage to him. So
excellent.
So
we're all for homages.
And so the first question is, what is your favorite word?
Well, you know, one could pick like a word just because I like the sound of it or whatever, but I think the idea behind a question like that in a circumstance like this, in this context, is a word that actually is meaningful. You know, not just I like the sound of. So I would say perseverance is a word that's very important to me, because I think it's a very important quality. And the biggest compliment I've ever gotten from someone was a woman who told me that what she most admired about me was my perseverance. And it's something we all, if you're going into this business, that's a word you better know, because you're going to need it.
I love that, because it's not success, but it's the journey. You know.
Yeah, and the willingness, you're going to get knocked down. We all get knocked down constantly. And it's the willingness, after you lie there and feel sorry for yourself for a little while, to get up and just keep going. You know, that's easy to say. It's not easy to do. And it's a quality that I think is very important for anyone who wants to be certainly in musical theater.
Right. So the corollary to that is, what is your least favorite word?
I have a lot of them. I would say denial, or maybe denialism. Denial, because it means more things. I find nothing so irritating as people, you know, who deny things out of ideology or out of discomfort with facing the truth. Number one, I think like the only way to move forward as an individual and as a society is to accept the truth, not deny it. And also, I think it's important that we as human beings and as artists don't deny opportunity and the right to flourish to anybody else. So again, it's not that I don't like the sound of the word, but I don't like the concept.
Well, it ties in very clearly with what you said at the very beginning of this interview about one of the great aspects of art is empathy. And empathy is sort of the opposite of denial, right? You can't be in denial and feel from someone's perspective.
That is true. Empathy would be my second favorite word. I should have thought of that.
No, we already did.
Talked about it. Well, I'll go with perseverance.
So the third question is, what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I think the excitement of a new idea that resonates for me, whether it's a new idea that I want to explore as a writer, or whether it's a new idea that helps me broaden as a person, or, you know, if you talk about spiritually or whatever, just being open to something you haven't encountered before, and kind of recognizing, oh wait, I mean, an example of that is you know, and everybody probably knows this story by now because it's been told so many times, but, you know, that I happened in the most random way to be on a holiday when someone said to me, just in passing, oh, I'm reading this interesting book. It's by this guy named Gregory Maguire. It's called Wicked. And it's kind of the Oz story from the Wicked Witch's point of view. And I was like, oh my God, that's like the best idea I've ever heard. And it just feels so much my territory that, you know, that's such a turn on to have a moment like that.
Well, I see that in inspiration in so many of your works. I mean, taking an idea that you think that you know, and just looking at it from a different point of view.
Yeah.
You know, seeing the parables of Saint Matthew, you know, and setting them like James Taylor, or the tales of Charlemagne and putting it into, you know, the Commedia dell'arte, and that's what it's so fascinating to see someone really fully embrace seeing something from a totally different point of view. I love that about your work.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and I feel like that is sort of what's central to the kind of work I like to do.
Hmm. So the corollary to what turns you on is what turns you off.
Well, we talked earlier about collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people who won't collaborate for whatever reason, you know, people who think that they know it all, or, you know, they're fearful, so they won't, you know, collaborate, both in art, but also in life. I think that, you know, people who won't cooperate, people who won't collaborate, people who are like my way or the highway, or us versus them, all of that is a huge turnoff to me.
So what is your favorite curse word?
Oh, well, I already used it. Fuck is the, you know, it's a word that means so many things. It can mean positive things. It can mean negative things. It's so useful. I overuse it in conversation, but it's a very, very valuable word in our language.
Utilitarianism, I like it.
Extremely utilitarian, yeah.
So what sound or noise do you love?
I actually like silence. We have so little of it, and I find that I really have come to value times when I can be still and it's still around me. That's very replenishing to me. I mean, maybe that's ducking your question,
No,
but the sound of silence, excuse me, Paul Simon, is rare, and I find it very, rejuvenating.
So what sound or noise do you hate?
Well, kind of the opposite, like an ambulance siren, because I spent so much time in New York City, which is like there's just constant sirens going off, and it's not just that the sound is so annoying and made to be deliberately so, to just penetrate anything so cars and people will get out of the way, but also, of course, it just signals somebody's in trouble. So yeah, that's what I would say.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, well, people know this. There were times when, you know, I actually went back to school to study psychology. I would love to have been a psychotherapist, you know, whatever the, you know, like, you know, see clients or whatever. And in some parallel universe, that's what I'm doing. I wish that I'd been able to do both careers, because I missed that. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
What profession would you not like to do?
Oh, wow. Well, I hope I won't insult people by saying this, but, you know, the idea of like a desk job where you basically have to do the same thing every day, I'm very grateful to my own accountant, but I really would not like to have been an accountant.
He probably doesn't want to be a composer either. So,
Well, no, I think accountants do want to be composers.
oh, maybe
But
they.
there are people who and in fact, the accountant I work most frequently with, who's also a friend of mine and is actually quite brilliant. He always wanted to be an accountant. That's just what he wanted to do. Thank goodness.
I love that. The final pivot question is, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Oh, that's easy. I would like to hear God say, "I apologize." And I would think pretty much everybody would like to hear that. You can pick your reasons, but if there's anybody who has any control over, is making any choices, they have a lot to apologize for. Let me just put it that way.
That's great. Thank you so much for these honest answers.
Absolutely. I've probably offended lots and lots of people.
No, it's great. We're going to we're just a few more minutes, and we're going to take some questions from
Fantastic.
People in our audience. So this is from Andrew. He says, "Hi, I'm a music directing undergrad at the University of Michigan, and was wondering what you look for in a music director directing one of your shows."
First of all, Andrew, you're at a great school, obviously. School with an enormously great tradition of musical theater, from which have come many wonderful composers and musical directors. So you're already in a very good place to be learning your craft. First of all, you want someone who is an excellent musician. I look for someone who I feel gets what I do, just has an intrinsic understanding of my style. That was true of Stephen Oremus and Alex Lackamoire, and now Dominic Amendum, the guys that I've worked with, recently. They just understood what I meant in terms of tempos and where to be robotic. They just got it. And you can't explain that. And I would say, maybe they were ideal musical directors for me. Maybe they wouldn't be for a different composer, just as some who would be great for certain composers wouldn't be ideal for me. The other thing I look for is the ability to teach the music to the cast and to the orchestra, but more to the cast, of course, and a real meticulousness. Detail orientation, I think, is extremely important for musical directors.
That's great. This question is from Adam. He says, "Hello, I'm Adam, a second-year MFA candidate in scenic design at SDSU. After writing and developing the show with your collaborators, what was your reaction when you saw Eugene Lee's idea for the world of Wicked?" And he says, "Thank you for taking the time to speak with us."
Yeah, I mean, obviously the set designer is so crucial to all shows, but absolutely to musicals, because they create the world, but they also define, working with the director, how the show is going to move, how you're going to, because their musicals generally are in a bunch of different locations, and how specific are you going to be about the location, and how are you going to get from one location to the other. I will tell you that in the case of Wicked, we actually had a design off, if you will, because Joe Mantello wasn't sure who he wanted to use as a designer. And so we went to about 6 wonderful designers and asked them to just come in and do some kind of presentation. They were all great, and different people did different things, showed like color things or pictures out of magazines. The last person we saw was Eugene Lee. He came in with 2 assistants and a complete model of the set. And he set it up on the table, and he showed how it was going to move, and there were the gears, and he, first of all, he created a world that we didn't expect. I always thought the show was going to look very high tech. The fact that Eugene Lee came in with an idea that was deliberately low tech in appearance was so interesting. to me. And then he basically said, here's what it's going to look like, and here's the show. And that's how he got the job. So that's another thing. I mean, it's not quite answering the question you asked, but it's a useful question that,
Sure.
you know, listen, he could just as easily have done all that work for nothing, but he didn't. And that all the work that he put in paid off in terms of him getting the gig.
That's great. There's a couple of questions here about auditions. One from Jeanette, who asks, in an audition process, what makes an actor stand out from the rest in a positive way? And then from Regan, when an actor is coming into audition for one of your shows, how do you feel about them singing a song that you've written?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. So different composers feel differently about this. And I know, for instance, when I first started out and I was an accompanist and there were still Richard Rodgers shows, we were told that Mr. Rogers did not want you to sing one of his songs. And I know other composers who feel that way. I feel differently. I'm absolutely perfect. You don't have to sing one of my songs, but I'm perfectly fine if you do, because it helps me to judge how my music will sit in your voice and how you'll deal with the kind of interpretation that we talked about earlier. But what you should know is if you do the composer's work, I know where the bodies are buried in my songs. I know where the tough spots are. I know what to listen for. I know where, you know, where there are problems to be solved. And so I'll be able to make a more informed decision about you if you sing one of my songs, and that can work either in your favor or against you. I would just say if you're going to sing a composer's song, you better do that song really well and know what you're singing about. In terms of what makes a positive impression, I think it's someone, this is so easy to say and so hard to do, who comes in and is basically viewing the audition as an opportunity to do this performance with no expectation beyond that. In other words, without that kind of neediness, without trying too hard. You need to, I'm not saying like be blasé or lackadaisical, but if you're able to be like, I'm just enjoying the chance to perform for an audience of these people, and I'm just gonna show what I can do and bring this character or this song to life and not have any need beyond that, that gives a kind of focus that I think is impressive in audition. Because look, these days, I mean, particularly in New York City or in London, everybody who comes through that door is going to be able to sing well. They're going to be able to hit the notes. They're all going to be talented. So there are little ineffable things that make you notice someone, and I think that's part of it. A kind of joy of the performance, if you will.
That's amazing. Here's another question from, this is from Charlie. Hello, Charlotte here. I'm graduating in this chaotic time. She asked, what soundtrack would you give our world right now if we were living in a musical?
Oh, I guess I'd give everybody Children of Eden again. Seems appropriate, you know. A world that gets destroyed and has to rebuild, and one hopes can make smarter choices this next time around.
Yes. All right, here's another question. There's a series of questions that have a similar theme to this. It's about being surprised. So this is from Jamie Buxton. Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for being here. She says, I was in the crowd at OCU in 2001 when you gave a workshop and presented to us an early draft of Defying Gravity at the piano. Did you know when you wrote that song, what you had on your hands, or did its enormous success surprise you? And a lot of other people said, did you write anything that surprised you Could you riff on that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always surprised by the outcome of everything, because
How
I've
so?
just learned that you just never know what's going to happen with something. I did feel with Defying Gravity, and partly because I had a wonderful collaborator in Winnie Holtzman to sort of bounce things off of, and I felt like I had gotten that I'd solved the assignment, if you know what I mean, that it felt like Elphaba to me, and it felt like who she was at that moment, and the music sounded like it, and I liked the title, which I got with the help from Winnie, and so I had a good feeling about the song within the show, but then Joe Mantello staged it brilliantly, and Susan Hilferty did this astonishing costume, and Kenny Posner did the single best lighting for that number that I've ever seen in the musical theater, so everything just came together. And then Adina sang it the way Adina sang it, and subsequent Elphabas have. So it just all came together to go over the top, if you will. And that's not me alone, obviously. That's the collaboration we've all been talking about.
That's great. We're going to have one last question here before we've got to go. This is from Maya, and she asks, who is your biggest inspiration?
Oh, gosh, there have been so many of them. You've heard me talk about some of them. I don't think there's any one person or one writer that's been, that I would say like, that's my inspiration. But I feel that I've learned so much. People talk about my style, and they're like, oh, I can always, you have a writing style, and I recognize, when a song is yours, or, I can tell it's like, oh yeah, that's a show of yours. But I feel like from the inside, my style is just taking lots and lots of things that I've liked and responded to from other composers, whether it's, Beethoven or Rachmaninoff or Bernstein, or seeing how Steve Sondheim builds to the end of a song, or seeing the sort of subtle harmonies that Richard Rodgers will come up with, or seeing how Laura Nyro will vary tempo and rhythm within one song, and then all those things sort of come together, and they just come out. I have so many composers and other artists have been influential on me and continue to be as I hear things. But there isn't one where I was like, oh, that's what showed me the path to thus and so.
And what do you see in the future? What are other, you mentioned Pasek and Paul, of course, but there are other young artists that you see coming up that are carrying on the legacy?
There are so many talented writers coming up out there. I've had the privilege of being the artistic director, for want of a better word, of the ASCAP Musical Theater Workshop for, 20 years now. And I've seen, people come in, and they're getting so good. The craft is getting good. And, for a long time, I was hearing work that was kind of derivative, where you'd be like, oh, this person's been listening to too much Steve Sondheim, or more recently, this person's been listening to too much Lin-Manuel Miranda. They haven't found their own voice. But I'm seeing that less and less. I think people are much more having the courage of their own artistic visions. And Justin and Benj deservedly got off to a really quick start, but I hear some, Joe Iconis just had this big success with Be More Chill, but I've known Joe's work for a long time. And there are a lot of people out there. I just hope that the opportunities will be open to them, and particularly, when we come back from all this shut down, whatever theater will be. But yeah, there's a lot out there.
Thank you so much. And virtual applause for Stephen Schwartz today. Many thanks to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I hope it was useful to the
Very useful.
kids who were there. Yeah.
Yeah. The SDSU Studio Series returns on Friday, April 24th at 1 p.m. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time with So You Think You Can Dance choreographer Al Blackstone. The series continues on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at the same time until May 6th. See our website for details, sdsustudioseries.wordpress.com. And thank you once again, Stephen. It's been really great.
My pleasure. Al is great, by the way, and ask him about a thing called Born to Dance. He's very, very talented.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Thank you so much again. Bye now.